this chapter, we will study about the biodiversity. Now, the biodiversity is basically the sum total and collection of all living organism in an ecosystem. So, means it is the sum total of all living organisms in an ecosystem. Now, the biodiversity are classified into the three main parts. The first one is genetic diversity, genetic biodiversity. The second is species. And the third is habitat. Now, in the genetic biodiversity, it means all the variations of the genes within a species. This is what genetic biodiversity means. That is basically the variations of genes within species. So, the greater these genetic biodiversity is, it means the more better adaptability it has for the environment. So, the greater means more better adaptability for the environment. Similarly, we have a species biodiversity, which means a variety of species within a geographical area. So, we can write it as variety of species within a geographical area. So, example like equatorial rainforest is one of the example. Similarly, the other is a habitat biodiversity, which means that the variety of ecosystem which can be found within a region. So it is variety of ecosystems which can be found in a region. Can be found in a region. So this is how we classify the biodiversity. Now, when we talk about the hotspot of the biodiversity, the biodiversity is not uniformly distributed in India, not even in India, but in the world across, because certain areas are rich in biodiversity, whereas certain not. For example, in India, it comprises a 2.4% of the world. So if I write here as the India, 2.4% of the world it comprises, but at the same time of world area, but it occupies the 8% of species of the global biodiversity. And more importantly, that you need to remember that as we move away from the equator and goes towards the pole, the biodiversity decreases. So if this is an equator, this is a pole, as we go towards it, the biodiversity will decrease, means it is highest in the equatorial regions. So this is how the biodiversity has been classified. Now, about the biodiversity hotspots, there is a particular condition that need to be met. These are basically the regions that you need to remember, which should have at least 1500 endemic vascular plant species available, plus 70% of total vegetation which has been destroyed. So if such conditions are met, then that place is what we call the biodiversity hotspot. So in India, there are actually 4 such regions. The one of them is what we call the Indo-Burma region. This is basically some parts of Assam are covered here. The second is basically the Himalayan. The third is basically our Western Ghats and Sri Lanka, The fourth is basically the Sunda land, that is basically the parts of Car Nicobar region. So this is how basically the biodiversity has been classified in India. Now, apart from that, there is also important thing that we need to know, that the UN Decade of the Biodiversity, this is an important point, that UN Decade of Biodiversity is for 2010 to 2020. So this is the last year for the UN Decade of the Biodiversity. So there is maybe a chance that they can ask that this question, that which decade it is. So yes, we are currently in that period. So this is what it is. And more importantly about these things is that when we study the biodiversity, we study it on the basis of the three parts, that is the climatic factors and the biogeographical factors and the florist realm, right? So when I say that we want to study the biodiversity, we can study it through the climatic factor, we can study it through the biogeographical zone, we can also study through the floristic realm. I won't go deep dive in these things because from the biodiversity they have not asked many questions in the recent time, but the important thing is that these conditions that you should remember. So that is the main thing, a crux of all these things. And apart from that, in 2000 and if you remember the Kofii Annan, actually the Kofii Annan started MEA, that is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So MEA in 2000 by Kofii Annan. Let me also write the full form also here. Millennium Ecosystem Services. So what he said, that in these they have defined various ecosystem services. So they have said that the ecosystem services has been divided among four main parts. The first thing is basically what they said, that provisioning services. Provisioning services. Let us highlight this thing like this. The second thing they have said, that the ecosystem providers regulatory services. The third thing is basically the cultural services. And finally, we have the fourth thing, that is basically the supporting services. So basically, when we say that the provisioning services are provided, it actually means that these are quantifiable in nature. Means all those services which are quantifiable and provided by the nature. Quantifiable. So for example, you can say the raw materials are there, right? You can say like medicine, the biogenic materials. You can say the biomass fuel, hydropower, genetic material, and all these things comes under this category of provisioning services. Similarly, when we say a regulatory services, these are not in the form of product but responsible for regulating the product. So we can say, for example, like moderation, like when there's extreme climatic condition, it rains, right? Similar to that, like purification, like decomposition or detoxification, you know, pest or disease controls, etc. So these are what the regulatory services are. Similarly, we have cultural services. Now, the cultural services are pretty much like associated with the religion itself, the rituals, uh, the linguistic diversity, how they worship these things, or education. This is what the cultural services are. And then the supporting services. These are those services which supports all these previous three of them. For example, soil formation and nutrient cycle. Similarly, it can be the primary production too. So all these things basically comes together and what we call as the ecosystem services, which was discussed in the MEA, that is the Millennium Ecosystem Services, in 2000. And apart from that, when we say that importance of these biological diversity, so there are multiple of them. So if you say importance of these are like, you know, it provides the food for everyone, it provides habitat for everyone, for the economy itself, the raw material, the coal, for the medicine, you know, for the education. So there are multiple points, and you can yourself write these things because these are the basic buffer points that sometimes you need in your, the mains answer writing. So these are the few things that we should know about. And apart from that, there one thing that we need to discuss is that the loss of biodiversity, because that's a good thing that we need to study about. So basically, this is what we talk about the extinctions. That is, it's a basically natural process. The 90% of the life form that once lived, they are extinct in the different phases of extinction. For example, like there was a Permian extinction, Cretaceous extinction, Pleistocene age. So we gonna discuss this thing in the geography itself, but there are a few things that you should know, that there have been different extinction period, and in which the masses, the 90-95% of the life form has been completely eradicated from the planet Earth. At present, we are at the sixth mass extinction, which is what we call as the Anthropocene extinction. Now, in older extinction, the life form do not terminate abruptly. They were evolved. Their gene flow continued through the new life forms. For example, like, the modern horse, there was an Equus. Equus was there in the Pleistocene era. But now we see the modern horse, it is completely different from that. Similarly, the dinosaurs, their genes can be, the traced back at present time through the birds. Similarly, the mammoths and the elephants. So yes, in the older extinction, the life form did not terminate abruptly. They have evolved themselves. But in the human case, the human extinction is a drastic, and it is 10,000 times more than the natural rate of extinction. So when I say the natural rate, is basically 0 to 1 species, the human induced is extinction is basically human induced. It is basically the 30 species per year. I mean, this is basically a rate of extinction taking place. Even, the WWF report clearly said that 1970 to 2010, we have lost more than 50% of the species. More importantly, the IUCN even said that the 10 to 20% of the mammals are threatened due to the hunting. So if we see the points, that what are the points which lead to the extinction, so as per the United Nations, they have said the main reason for the loss of the biodiversity are, the first one is the loss of habitat. That is because of the deforestation, or you can say the destruction of the coral reef, destroying corals. Second point, they have said that it is due to the pollution and contamination. Pollution and contamination comes like a eutrophication is there, the biomagnification is there. You must have heard about the vultures. We have, uh, in the Punjab region, they used to throw the diclofenac, when the dead bodies die. The vulture feed on the dead organic matter. So when there is a diclofenac, when they consumes the cattle or something else, there is a diclofenac in the body, and when the vultures consume that dead meat, they die because of that, because of the high level of chemicals in their body. That's a biomagnification. Similarly, invasion of alien species. Now, this alien species doesn't mean like ET or Jadoo. No, it's not that. The alien species means an exotic species that can compromise the indigenous species. For example, like cichlids, we have discussed. They have brought to Tanzania lake, which have destroyed the local population of the fishes in Tanzania lake. So yes, similarly the water hyacinth, or which is also called the lantana weeds. Similarly, this is if you read about these weeds, these are also called the Bengal terror. They were actually the ornamental which were brought by the British themselves so that they can decorate the with the floristic visions. But now it is called the Bengal terror because it cannot be controlled. They have completely destroyed the local flora of that region. That's why we call it as a Bengal terror. Similarly, the eucalyptus is also one of the example for in India, because the eucalyptus trees, they consume so much amount of the groundwater that it completely drain the groundwater from that area. That is why it is not legal to plant eucalyptus tree. And originally the eucalyptus was brought from the Australia by the Britishers themselves. So yes, this is what happens. And the fourth is basically the agriculture and domestication. For example, like artificial ecosystem, which leading the man and animal conflicts. This is also the one of examples where the main biodiversity has been lost. Apart from that, we also need to discuss about the conservation of these biodiversities. So, conservation of biodiversity. Now, when we say the conservation, it happens through the two main ways. The first one is basically what we call as in situ, and the second one is what we call as the ex situ conservation. Now, the in situ conservation means that you are conserving the biodiversity at its original place. You are not creating anything artificial for them, you are not taking them or relocating them again. Whereas then ex situ means that you are relocating, it is not, you're not doing a conservation at its original location. So under the in situ, for example, like the sacred groves and the complexes are there. Another example can be the national parks. Another example can be the wildlife sanctuaries. It can be the biosphere reserves. Similarly, for the ex situ, they can be the botanical garden. There can be the seed garden. And there can be the cryopreservation. So this is what it basically means. Similarly, there are certain called the ecological hotspots. It is a concept was given by the Norman Mears, and the number of endemic species and the degree of threat. I think we have already discussed that thing. So a few points and add on to that thing itself is that, let me add it there itself so that you remember. So yes, So biodiversity hotspots, yeah. So, there are a few things more actually. The first thing is that till now, all over the world, we are able to find only the 25 hotspots, and this is merely 1.9%. And out of these, the 15 are located in the tropical areas, whereas the 5 in temperate areas and the 9 on islands. You don't have to remember it, but when you're writing the mains examination and they ask you anything regarding the biodiversities, these are the few points from where you can start your introduction, and these are the really, really amazing points which can fetch you great marks. So yes, so this is mainly about the biodiversity. We'll discuss rest in the next chapter. Thank you.